Hello, I'm Representative Ben Frederick. I'm delighted to be here for an edition of a legislative report and joined by a constituent of mine, Ryan Painter, who is actually from Owasso, part of the 85th District, but he's also director of the Elder Justice and At-Risk Adults Unit for the Prosecuting Attorneys Association of Michigan. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you for having me.
I really wanted to get with you after you were so kind to be a featured presenter at this elder abuse event that I held in the district this year. And some of the resulting questions that we had from participants and about the work that you did was just so compelling. My hope was that we could, in this show today, go over some of the things that you do, some of the very important advice that you gave and do give to those who may suspect that a loved one is the victim of abuse. We're talking about elderly, vulnerable adults, or steps that they can take as they think about their retirement years and beyond to protect themselves or put things in motion that would allow them to have some sense of security as they reach that situation. So I guess I'd like to start to say, what do you see in your role? Could you talk a bit about the role that you have and the team that you have and maybe what trends you're seeing in this area?
Absolutely. Well, certainly this is a growing problem. It's not a problem just in Michigan, it's a problem nationwide. We see the trends are going up. Elder abuse is on the rise. If you look at the numbers that we get yearly from Adult Protective Services, and again, nationwide, as well as in the state of Michigan, you'll find that their number of referrals is going up pretty drastically. Now, I think that's for two reasons. One is because there are more incidents of elder abuse, which would make sense given that we have an aging population. But two, I think word is finally getting out. People are beginning to understand and see elder abuse as a problem. They understand better, I think, what it is. And so when they see it or when they suspect that they see it, they're more liable to call APS and report it. So on the one hand, the trend of numbers going up could be seen as a good thing in the sense that more of these cases are getting reported and dealt with. But it is troubling that this is becoming such a problem. If you look at it in the sense of dollars and cents, I've seen various numbers on a nationwide scale, and admittedly it's a difficult thing to really wrap your arms around because so much of it is heavily underreported that it's tough to get a solid number. But we're looking probably nationwide at a figure upwards of $50 billion a year. So this is something that is a drag on the U.S. economy to the scale of the entire state economy of Vermont in a year. So it is certainly very troubling. The other side of the coin is that when you have incidents of financial abuse, you oftentimes have a co-occurrence of physical abuse and neglect. And very frequently what I tell my police officers when we do trainings is that if you have a case where you have a clear case of physical abuse and or neglect and or abandonment, there's a very good chance that there is or was some degree of financial abuse that went along with that. Markers that we look for are misuse of joint bank accounts, powers of attorney, and usually you'll find a family member, whether it's a grown son or daughter or sometimes even a grandson or granddaughter who has moved in to take care of an elderly family member. And so when you have a sort of we call it a parasitic living arrangement, that also is a red flag. And it's something that's not immediately obvious. So we sometimes tell our police officers and we tell our APS workers, you know, you have to think outside the box. You have to look at these situations and really try and dig a little below the surface. One of the tips that we tell our senior citizens who are at our trainings and events is that probably the best way to protect yourself from becoming a victim of abuse is to stay engaged, to really be a part of your community and to not withdraw. It's so easy later in life as loved ones move away, your friends age and die, and it can be a very depressing time, it can be a very lonely time, and there can be an urge, and we've seen this in many of our victims. There can be an urge to find friendship where maybe there isn't actually friendship. There's actually a predatory inclination on the part of the family member or caregiver. So stay engaged. If you're a member of a church, stay engaged in your church. Stay engaged in your social groups and really try and keep those connections up, because the more engaged you are, the less likely it is you'll be seen as a potential victim. because some of the factors we see in these cases really mirror what we have seen for the last 20, 30 years in domestic violence cases. What we've learned in domestic violence cases is there's a power and control element. Now, it's not exactly synonymous. It's not a direct carryover from the one to the other, but it's close enough that I think you can learn from it. So when you have a family member who begins to try to even groom or isolate that elderly victim by cutting off their connections, we even see this in our bank tellers. When I've talked to banking folks, one of the things that they notice is that maybe for 20 years they've had the same customer, an elderly customer, and they tend to be creatures of habit. Most people are, and seniors are no different from the rest of us. They'll go to the same bank. They tend not to do online banking. Oftentimes they'll go to the same teller. And yet there comes a point when the bank stops seeing that customer. Now it's the grown son, or oftentimes it's the grown daughter's boyfriend or someone like that, who starts showing up, and they have a power of attorney document. And then that's followed by large withdrawals of cash or transfers of cash into other accounts out of the senior's account. And those are immediate red flags. So those are the kinds of things that we see and that we need to, I think all of us, really be aware of. Because frankly, no one's responsible for your own safety but yourself. But that's not a good enough answer. I think the only real way to combat elder abuse in all of its forms, financial and physical, is to, as a community, come together and make the decision that whether I'm the meter reader going house to house and I'm seeing things during the day and I'm aware of things and I'm seeing maybe a home that is in disrepair and someone who needs help, or I'm a police officer doing a welfare check, or I'm an APS worker really doing my bit to try and help my community, or I'm just a friend or family member or a neighbor who notices something amiss. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to make contact with your friend or loved one or neighbor and just ask them how things are going and whether they're okay. I think if all of us did that bit to try and reach out and just be a good neighbor, frankly, you'd see a drastic decrease in the number of these cases.
That's a very good point. I think we can point to a lack of connectedness as the root cause of a lot of the challenges we're seeing in society, where people don't have that feel that they're part of the fabric of their own community or their neighborhood. Can we talk a little bit about the mechanics of some of these tools which facilitate the abuse? You've mentioned powers of attorney. You've mentioned people who have their name added to a bank account. These things are bandied about, and I think there's a lack of cognizance, I think, for individuals about how much power is granted in those scenarios, what people can and can't do. Let's say in the example of the joint bank account, it's still, as I understand it, the original person's funds. How are those things addressed?
Well, those are some interesting points, and I think it's important that we clarify in our minds what exactly we're talking about and what the limitations are of each of these different tools. Part of the reason they're so dangerous is because they're so powerful. And I'll start with the example of a power of attorney. I literally can't tell you the number of cases we've had, whether I've been involved directly or that we've had come in for referrals from local prosecutor's office, police departments, and APS workers across the state of Michigan, where the chief tool used to rip off and defraud someone was a power of attorney. I can tell you that the state of law in Michigan is different than it was a few years ago. As of 2012, the rules governing power of attorneys were toughened up. So if you have a power of attorney that was drafted since 2012, and that's probably going to be most of them, there are certain elements of that power of attorney, including very clear boilerplate language within the document required by statute that says clearly that there's a fiduciary relationship between the two parties. What does that mean? I got to break that down. Fiduciary duty just means that the one person, the caregiver, owes a complete duty of loyalty to the other person, which would be the elderly person. And that would mean things like keeping an accounting of any monies that are spent, keeping receipts, and frankly, obeying the wishes and best interests of the elderly person. So a power of attorney is not a license to steal. A power of attorney does not give you access to that other person's assets simply for your own benefit. And where we find that there has been an unjust enrichment of the caregiver, that alone by itself, regardless of any allegation that there was permission given, that alone can be enough to bring a criminal charge. Power of attorney is a very misused document, and I think part of the problem is too many people are downloading them online, or they're not telling their attorney who drafts it enough about their specific situation. They really should be custom tailored to your direct needs and should be no broader than they absolutely have to be. In my mind, the best power of attorney is one that's limited maybe only to a very specific one bank account. And so that would be the only access you'd have. On the matter of bank accounts, a joint bank account is often a workaround used by families who don't want the expense of a power of attorney, or they don't know what a guardianship is, and that's not something that perhaps is appropriate for their situation. A word on joint bank accounts. Because so many people have their interaction with a joint bank account through their spouse, there's an assumption that a joint bank account means that everything in the account is jointly owned. Now, for most of us, that is in fact true. If you and your wife have a joint bank account, then per the marriage laws, whatever's in that account belongs to the both of you. Where that rule breaks down is where two people who are not spouse own that account. The way to think about it is you own the account but not the money that's in it. So if I'm a caregiver and I have a joint bank account, let's say with my own mother, if all the money can be shown to have come from her Social Security and perhaps a small annuity or a pension, maybe from an auto maker, because we have so many factory workers, we have a large number of folks who have a pension and a Social Security income. These are very easy to chart. You're going to see the exact same numbers month after month after month, and police officers can look at that and break it down very simply. So we know whose money it is. When we see that money coming out, whether it's large ATM withdrawals or checks being written, and it's by the caregiver, the question is the caregiver spending those monies for the benefit of the victim, or is he or she using them for their own benefit? So an example, we've had several cases here in the Lansing area where we have elderly folks who can't drive, and we see large expenditures coming out at gas stations. Well, it could be that some of those trips are being used to take the victim to, let's say, a doctor's appointment. But more than that, it becomes suspicious, and you start to see that there's a pattern. So clearly there's a pattern of abuse. The money is being used for some purpose other than the betterment of the victim. We have a word for that. It's theft. It really is that simple. If you take the money out and you didn't put it in, and you're spending it for your own benefit, you're stealing the money. Another way to think about it would be if you really do truly believe that that money in that account is yours as well as the victim's, that should be a taxable event. And yet you haven't declared that as income. And I can warn people that in conjunction with the Attorney General's office, we have begun forwarding these cases to the State Treasury for follow-up. So it's not a laughing matter. A joint bank account, likewise, is not a license to steal.
So really what you're describing here for those who wish to be caregivers in a sound way is that you have to treat it like a business transaction, and that it has the respect of expensing things properly, showing the proper utilization of funds, and you're keeping good records. I don't go into this thinking that the primary number of people that are put in a caregiver role are looking to engage in criminal behavior. But the fact is, when you are faced with that dynamic, as many are, you have to be very concerned with having good records and showing, as you say, the consent on the part of the person being cared for. And what I love you saying is that there's the assumption as the caregiver that you always have the best interest of that person you're caring for in mind. That's your mission, in effect, as a caregiver. And part of that is you assume the responsibility of sound record keeping and taking that transactional relationship and really giving that the importance and status it deserves. It deserves your best effort to record that you're honoring the wishes of that person you're caring for.
Well, that's exactly right. And before any caregivers out there sort of have a panic attack, I will say, in all honesty, the vast majority of caregivers are oftentimes either family members or they're professionals, nurses and whatnot. They're doing it for the right reasons, and they're doing their best effort. And I can tell you from my experience, law enforcement knows the difference. We're not going to beat you up over one, missing receipt or records that are maybe a little bit sloppy. If we see a pattern that you're treating it seriously and you are doing your best effort, and we don't feel that you're trying to rip somebody off.
What about the relationship where someone's left a job to care for the other person, and the person says, I want to compensate you for your time. I know you've stepped away from your career or you're reducing your hours. How would that work?
Well, those are tricky situations. They're also very, very common. And sometimes you do get into a bit of a gray area. What I would say is this: as long as the focus is the care of the elder adult, not so much the remuneration of the caregiver, but the care of the elder adult, then I think most law enforcement is probably not going to treat that in any sort of criminal way. Where you start getting into problems is if you have no real set agreement, and the amount of money that's coming out and when the money's coming out is simply left up to the caregiver. So if you have, let's say, you could have a power of attorney with a contract along with it that specifies that the caregiver is going to be paid such and such amount hourly rate for the following services, and there's a power of attorney that incorporates that contract, then as long as you stick to that document, then you're probably going to be okay. Where you have a problem is, let's say, the example of the adult son or daughter who moves in to take care of their elderly parent, and they're sort of just willy-nilly taking money out of the parent's bank account. And generally what you'll see is, whereas in the months prior to that, the vulnerable adult spending habits were more or less in line with what their income was, you'll see that the caregiver moves in and suddenly there's a huge decline in the bank account and a huge uptick in debt. And those are immediate signs to me that, in fact, this caregiving relationship is a scam. So I think anyone who's looking to kind of keep an eye on a friend or family member, that is one of the key things to look at, is to talk to that vulnerable adult and ask them if they have an idea of what their banking situation is, if they know where their checkbook is, if they've seen it recently, and if they understand how much money's coming in or out. Because even if someone says, well, that's okay, my son's taking care of me and I gave him permission to pay for his gas and to pay for some of his food and whatnot, they may not really have a very good idea of just exactly how much their caregiver is taking out of their account. And sometimes all it takes is that quick and lightning conversation with a friend, family member, or sometimes it's a police officer or APS worker. Sure. And suddenly the entire relationship takes on a whole different tenor.
That's very good advice. Let's switch a little bit the perspective of what we're exploring here. Put yourself in the position of the person who is nearing retirement, needs to take steps to ensure that these proper legal and other mechanisms are in place. What would you advise to someone who's looking at those decisions that they have to make post-retirement or for their own care? Because to me, it's a matter of how tragic it is that we are often, as individuals, it's put off until we have a more fragile situation. Either we're in physical decline, we may be suffering some mental decline, and now we're faced with these decisions of setting up this apparatus of caregiving and so on. What steps would you suggest someone take who's looking at that coming forward? That's
a great question. Let me start with a caveat by saying no one should rely on what I'm about to say as binding legal advice. Nothing is better than going to your own trusted attorney and talking about your own specific situation.
So that's the first piece of advice.
That's the first piece of advice. Don't hold me to it. But more seriously, everyone needs to treat their situation as unique, because it is in fact unique. So it shouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. You have to be responsible for your own retirement, and you need to pay attention and be careful with what your plans are. Everyone should have a will, and at least spend some time thinking about what you would like to have access to later in years. I see a lot of trouble that people run into when they put everything into a trust, for instance. A trust can be a very good and useful tool, but all too often I find people lock assets into a trust and they don't really realize what the repercussion of that is going to be, or just how limited their access to those trust monies can be. You should also really spend some time to think about what your spending is going to look like so you don't get yourself into trouble. Try to budget it out the way that most of us budget our own families now. You have to recognize that incomes are going to be drastically lower when you're retired for most people, but you could have increased expenses, in particular medical expenses. That can get you into trouble, because if you get into a situation where you are very desperate for money and someone offers that hand of friendship and says, I'm willing to help by taking over your banking and by helping out and doing this and doing that, suddenly you've put yourself into a situation where you really don't have as much bargaining power as the other party. And even if that caregiver means the best at first, that unequal relationship can lead into trouble. So for most people, I would say stay engaged, keep your friendships, stay members of groups, and really take the time to invest, and I don't just mean in terms of money, but in terms of hours and thought into what your retirement is going to look like and what your later years are going to look like. Everyone should have a will. You don't need to spend a fortune on talking to an attorney. And most attorneys can give you some very basic advice on some do's and don'ts, and it doesn't have to be that expensive. I think all too often that's a common refrain, is that I don't have the money to talk to an attorney. Well, you may not think you have the money to talk to an attorney now, but I guarantee it's a lot cheaper than losing your house or losing your nest egg to fraud. So it's money well spent.
So for those who have children, it seems like there'd be a natural conversation with their adult children about different roles and responsibilities and the things that the child or adult children may be comfortable taking on. What about the individuals who may not have children or for whatever reason are not comfortable with that type of arrangement? How would they ensure their own care should there be some type of physical or mental decline in the future?
Sadly, I don't believe there is any way, there's no ironclad way to ensure your own care, and that should be worrisome, frankly, for all of us. And I think that's because as a society, we draw the line between giving people independence and being a nanny state. And so there is some room for us to make mistakes or to vest our trust in the wrong family member. And unfortunately, that can have sad consequences. But for those people who don't have a trusted friend or family member to help them later in years, that social connection becomes all that more important. There are many, many groups and organizations in the state of Michigan that are willing to step in and help at all different levels. Some of them are free, some of them have some fee attached to them, but it is worthwhile to reach out in your own community to try to find where those groups are. You can start with your own Center on Aging and go from there, whether it's Meals on Wheels or even just your local police officer who does a welfare check every couple weeks to make sure everything's okay. There are resources for those folks who have trouble paying their heating bill through our utilities. So there are many different options out there, and sometimes people have trouble understanding what their options are and what kind of resources there are in their community, but it's worthwhile to reach out and find those. And frankly, some of us probably should figure some of that out when we're in our 50s so that we have an idea of what our resources are and where we can turn. One other thing I will say, I think there's a perception among many folks that Adult Protective Services is this sort of shadowy group that's going to come and take you out of your home and take your independence away from you. And it couldn't be farther from that. I've interacted with dozens and dozens and dozens of Michigan's APS workers over the years. These are really a great bunch of folks. They're interested in helping you. So if you find that you have money troubles, you find that you have help, you need help getting food, or even finding a place to live, reach out to APS. They can certainly be a friend and a resource, and they're willing to help. And I can tell you that their policy is, their goal is to maximize your independence and really try to help you live life the way you want to live it, not just to sort of snatch you out of your existence and do what they want to do. So there are many resources out there. That's not to say we don't need more, and certainly we would like to see more resources for the elderly and for vulnerable adults more generally. But be aware of those, and especially for those who don't have those close friends and family members, having all the social contacts you can get will help.
Well, we're nearing the end of our time, but I wanted to get from you an idea for our viewers. What would they expect to have happen if they themselves, or if someone they know, they feel may be the target of abuse? Obviously, we're going to have information on the screen here about the 24/7 hotline that exists in the state of Michigan, of course. But as they interact with these services, or frankly, as these cases move to your team, what should they expect as far as questions if they feel that they're a victim or if they know a victim? What should they have prepared when they reach out to potential intervention agencies?
That's an excellent question, and I believe we're going to flash the number for the APS Central Intake number. This is a statewide number that anyone can call. You don't have to be the victim. You can simply be a witness or a friend or family member who suspects abuse. If you're on the fence and you're not sure if what you're seeing is abuse, call and report it. We would rather get too many calls than not enough calls. Usually an APS worker will come out and speak with the party who called and or speak to immediately the vulnerable adult and ascertain the situation. If it does appear to be a criminal situation, they'll cross-report that to police, whichever local police department has the case. And so someone from the police will come out and also begin an investigation. If there's a financial component to it, then it would certainly help to have bank records and any other financial documents handy, or at the very least be willing to sign off permission so that police can gather those documents up without having to go through a lengthy period of getting a search warrant and subpoenas and all of that sort of thing.
Are you still able to proceed if the person who's being victimized does not want to cooperate? Let's say that they don't necessarily, maybe they have mental frailty or they frankly feel an affinity for the criminal. How are you able to proceed in those instances?
Well, let me say, first of all, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, and it's really going to be up to the local prosecutor as to whether they feel they have a case that they can get in front of a jury or not. But as a very general matter, the victim does not have to be able to testify or even be willing to testify in order to go forward with the case. And frankly, sadly, there are some of these cases where the victim, because they're elderly and infirm, pass away before the case can be brought before a jury.
Yes.
What we tell our police officers is treat these cases as if they were a homicide case, in the sense that don't assume you're going to have a victim who can testify. You need to work the case as if you don't have a victim. So it's going to be a circumstantial case. Build those records, get those financial documents, get those eyewitness testimonies from various friends and family members who were involved in the case. Build that case from the ground up, and if you have the victim who can testify and is competent to testify, all the better. But if you have mom or dad and they just don't want to testify against their family member, regardless of how poorly they were treated, we can proceed in those cases. If we have the other evidence in place, we can proceed in those cases.
Ryan, I want to thank you for taking some time to join us here and share your expertise on this topic. Appreciate the work that you do and have done for many years in this area. If you or someone you know is the suspected victim of abuse of the nature that we've described, please contact your local law enforcement agency or the 24/7 hotline, which information is being displayed on the screen. I'm Representative Ben Frederick. This has been my legislative report. Thank you for watching.